This is Phil Brochard, the rector of All Souls Berkeley. Phil was my administrative assistant when I worked for the diocese, and that was a long time ago.
A few years ago.
Before you were married.
Before I was married, before I was a priest. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And look how far he's come. So Phil is the rector of a congregation that is transitioning from pastoral to program size. How big are you at this point?
We are just probably a notch and a half below program size. The easiest, most incomplete measure or metric is average Sunday attendance, which is right now about 234 on a Sunday. So folks usually place at about 250 as per program or network.
Solid program. So take it away. Whatever you want to share with us about the leadership of what I'm calling mainstream congregations, that size transition, whatever your wisdom can bring.
All right. Well, then I think what I'm going to do is start with some stories. So All Souls has been on the north side of Berkeley since 1906. We started off as a mission of St. Mark's because people found it really challenging to go from the north side of Berkeley all the way to St. Mark's on a Sunday. Because, no automobiles. They were making trips either on foot or on horseback and by wagon train, I don't know. But it was really challenging, especially with kids. They started off with the Sunday school on the north side, and then by the mid-20s, they had established as their own congregation. One of the roles that I have understood over time that is really important for the leader, and this especially comes from a colleague of ours named Paul Fromberg, is that the leader really needs to be the chief storyteller. And so it is just, I cannot tell you how critical it is to learn the story of the place you serve. All of it. The parts especially that people don't want to talk about, but the parts that people are really excited to share. Because I think we know this because that's how we're formed with Scripture, but stories inform us, and over time, the more we repeat them, they form us. So All Souls was a pretty typical congregation of the Episcopal Church in the Bay Area, 1950s, post-war boom, really grew accordingly. You were still supposed to go to church because that's what you did. The 1960s hit All Souls pretty hard, both because of the social unrest here. Like Berkeley was one of the epicenters of that. The free speech movement, lots of destabilizing factors, not unlike where we are right now. There's lots of destabilizing factors in where we are right now culturally. So All Souls actually called the first African-American rector in this diocese, Henri Steins, came from inner city Chicago, and came out and did some great prophetic work and found it to be really hard. And he left after about 3 years to go back to Chicago to do some work, and the congregation was really in a rocky place, and they called a rector named William Power Clancy Jr.
Yeah, Bill Clancy.
Bill Clancy, and he was well named. Bill was a former Marine, a former federal prosecutor, and he used apparently all those skill sets when he came to All Souls. And so one of the things they tell about Bill was he really brought a lot of order to chaos, which some people really appreciated. And Bill saw himself squarely in the center of the life of the congregation as its leader. And so you all have seen these models before, but just for fun, there they are. One of the ways that the pastor-oriented model is shown is with the pastor here at the hub, and ministries and people all around here. And in order for something over here to happen, to get to here, it's got to go through here and out rather than around there or something like that. And so he was, one of the things that Bill was very, very strong. He was an incredible pastor. I've heard so many stories of people within the congregation, and like you were talking about the sense of locatedness, people in the neighborhood came and were up, and he counseled them and pastored them. Bless you. He also, one of the ways he lived that out is he had his, back in the 80s, he had his beeper number in the yellow pages. And so that was, for me, when I learned that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. That was not the model that I chose to emulate, but it's in the system, right? So he also was very involved here at CDSP. Mm-hmm. It was said that when Bill Clancy was there, they had hot and cold running seminarians. He had an internship that he ran over the summer for CDSP students.
Well, his wife was the CFO.
Here at CDSP.
When I was a student.
Yeah, Pat.
Yeah.
And so part of why I'm saying this is that, yes, that when Bill Clancy was the rector at All Souls, it was a very structured system, and he was very clearly at the center of it. One of the consequences to that I'll get into in a little bit was that there was only so much of Bill, right? One of the effects of that was Bill had a bed in his office. Not a good move. Right, for so many reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
So many reasons. And so what happened was that the system more and more relied on him, which he fed back into. By the end of his time there, so he started in 1972, was the rector there till 1989. By the mid-'80s, the vestry finally said, Bill, you've got to bring in an associate, which he did under great duress. And so Brooke Myers came in, and Brooke was later a rector of a congregation in this diocese. And it just proved impossible. Bill could not work in a differently oriented system. So he ended up leaving and was the first dean of the cathedral down in San Jose. Then there was a period of years. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is exactly the kind of thing that Irving Goffman's work would be helpful in unpacking, because Bill is making an impression. He's managing and maintaining an impression with the congregation, and what's not going on in those kinds of systems is understanding what is the cost that Bill pays for that, and why does he need to do that? What's the shadow side behind his need to be at the center, which it can't just be out of necessity for the system, because it outgrew his effectiveness, right? So there's because my parish has a similar rector in its history, and for every parishioner that tells me, oh, he was so wonderful, the night my father died, he was up all night with me, and I just think, well, what was not being attended to because this one guy was at the middle of everything, so.
And so there's other stories. So there seemed to be similarly placed leaders actually in the Episcopal churches in Berkeley at the time. At another congregation in Berkeley, that rector in the 70s and 80s, he always made house calls from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock every day to congregants' homes, right? Okay, so people loved that, right?
Sure.
I mean, he's coming to my house. They also knew what cocktail he liked to have, right? that was part of it. The other thing, I happen to be married. I've got kids. I wonder, so what was he trying to avoid at home?
Sure, right.
Honestly, right. Okay, you're going to be out for those hours.
Awesome.
Sorry, I got to be out. I can't.
Right, it's just my job, right? Bill left.
Some of us just go to the bar instead.
That's right. But then you have to pay. So you pay either way. So Bill left in 1989. The period from 89 to 97 was what some people refer to as the interregnum.
Did he retire or leave under duress?
He left. He didn't retire. He went to become the dean in San Jose. I think that he left because he finally saw that he couldn't do it anymore, and that the system finally said, "Bill, we want to do it this way," and he knew he couldn't do it that way. So they called another. They called another rector. It turned out to be a very difficult thing to follow Bill Clancy's system. I wonder why. Financially, also, Bill had a very. One of the stories that is told about All Souls is that we gave away 30% of our budget to outreach every year. Well, then you're like, oh my gosh, well that's pretty remarkable. How did that happen? Well, they considered their assessment part of their outreach, so that's a healthy chunk, right? And then Bill had developed very strong relationships with about 4 to 6 people who some people called his angels. And so when Bill found a project, a very worthwhile project, All Souls established hospice at Alta Bates. We were at the beginnings of the EMSH program for convalescent homes in this area. We, for a couple years, paid the salary for the vicar at Good Shepherd Berkeley and at Holy Trinity Richmond. I mean, there was great stuff happening, but it was because Bill had these friendships with these 4 or 5 people. When Bill left, those relationships left. Mm-hmm. And so when the first budget comes out and John Archer is there, and all of a sudden we're not giving 30% to outreach, people were furious because the story that they had been told was no longer true. Well, he was furious because what he had been told during the search process was no longer true. And so there was this really painful time. He ended up leaving within 2 years. There was an interim, Joe Britton, who is now the dean of Berkeley School at Yale, was called. He stayed for 3 years. His wife was called to a professorship in Paris.
What are you going to do?
Just so sad. But he, he actually was out here at CDSP sometime, about
recently,
a month or 2 ago, for the Dean's Conference. And he and I, if you ever have the opportunity, wherever you are, to talk to your predecessors, do it every single time. No matter whatever it takes, just do it.
Not just clergy.
Yeah, anybody that has been in leadership in your congregation or your setting, again, learning that story. And so for him, he found it to be a tremendously challenging call. One of the things he said to me, he said, is it still all-consuming? Right? And so even if Carla hadn't been called to the position in Paris, he was facing a decision point because he really felt like this was more of a long-term interim and that the interim hadn't really worked before him, and so now the work can begin. He ended up leaving, and after an interim, Andrew Walmsley was called to be the rector in 1997. Andrew was a partnered gay man, which was a big deal for the congregation. He, one of the things he saw in the search process was that All Souls was colloquially known here in this setting at a CDSP as All Ghouls, because it was so old. Everybody was so old. Right? Isn't that awesome? So one of the things he saw was that children need to be at the center of the life of the parish. And so he took many steps in that direction. They brought in godly play before godly play was, codified in books and things like that. He instituted a children's homily so that parents would see their kids coming up and see that they were being taught. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, the congregation really grew. It had been at about 185 for a while, until about 200. And then there was a building campaign that was successful in some ways, but also splintered the congregation and really served to highlight some undercurrents, right? And so All Souls was close, and it was, again, much like with Bill, it had built up from a pastorally oriented space into the possibility of network. And because of some of the dissent, but also for Andrew's own sense of how he held his space, it didn't quite make it. And in about So that was about 2002, 2003.
Such a common story.
Yeah, right. It's like
People walk up to that
over and
brink,
over.
and then
Yeah.
they just can't bring themselves, I think, to let go of the old story,
yeah,
the old metaphor, the old image.
Well, it might be because, and I mean, this is my experience in my context, is that old story is so old for all of us, it's hard to imagine what else there is.
Right.
And it's not, I think, that people are afraid to let it go or aren't willing to step across to the next one. There isn't a next one in place, really. So we're asking our
Yeah.
congregations to be kinds of pioneers in a way to say, yeah, we've always done it this way. And we think there could be something better. But that whatever that is so familiar that I mean, it doesn't surprise me
And
that
it
that's
demands so many different
Right,
things
right.
of the individuals in the community,
Right.
and it demands a different system.
right.
So
right.
it's a really big
Yeah.
hurdle.
yeah.
yeah.
So,
And at that point, most people, all they can see is loss.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because it involves loss.
That's right.
yeah.
Period. Change involves loss. But it also provides opportunities that you can't quite see, but you have to trust in. Seem familiar?
Yeah,
It's
right.
kind of part of our story, but that's the part that's really hard sometimes to trust in.
Right.
Andrew stayed another 4 years after that. One of the most important things that he did, Bill Swing, who was the bishop of this diocese before Mark Andrus, used to say, sometimes you just have to outlast the bastards.
Yeah.
And he did that. And it came at tremendous personal cost. Leadership is hard. You were joking earlier about, sharing with people how hard it is. But some aspects of it really are, and they do take a toll. And it did on Andrew. He retired in 2007. I came in 2008. And for about 4 years, we had pretty consistent growth in many different ways, right? I mean, like, I am searching for metrics that are more comprehensive than what we've got, right? More than just ASA and pledging units and average pledge and all that. And so, yeah.
For All Souls, I know number of godly play classrooms was one of the measuring units used by the congregation itself.
Yep.
And how much of our vision statement we've lived into. I know those are two.
Two metrics that we use.
Those are two metrics that this
Yeah.
congregation is using.
Yeah. The good thing that happened, many good things happened. One of them was that children really were at the center of the life of the parish. They actually lived into that. And whereas I've got some colleagues who, when they enter a congregation to be the leader, sometimes it can feel like you need to enter and bring lots of energy into the system, or that it's kind of at a standstill. I kind of had to run to catch up to where All Souls was. They were moving.
Yeah.
And so it was a good interim, and there was a really good leadership group, both with the search team and the vestry and the staff, and it just kept moving. So we were going for a few years. One of the things you may encounter as you enter a community, if you're the chief leader, is that people at the outset want a vision. They want to know, where are you going to take us? And so I've been reading Israel Galindo's book, which I highly recommend, The Hidden Lives of Congregations. I don't know. The reason why I like it is because it's got lots of lenses in it that are effective for all kinds of leaders in your community to read. It's got, the size, the Arlen Roth's size thing that I'll talk about in a little bit. It's got James Fowler's Stages of Faith. It's got several lenses. It's good stuff. One of the things that he says is that a leader really can't cast a vision until they've been in a community for 4 or 5 years. Because you just don't know them. And I have found that the currency of leadership is trust. And if you haven't built up the relationship with not necessarily with everybody, but with, the kind of core mass, then how can you know them well enough to say, I can see someplace else? So I really resisted that for several years, and then,
Can I ask you if that if you had that wisdom going in, like, I can't cast a vision until I know this community better, and also whether people accepted your resistance to providing them what they thought they were asking you for. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. Yeah, I think they did. I think it would have been different if we had been tanking.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because when,
Yeah.
and I just hate to be crude about it, but when things are going badly,
Like, do you have a lifeboat or not? Right?
right? And so I was able to say, wait. And then after about 4 years, we started a visioning process. Because of the way the year just happened to work, we had to do it over the summertime, which I thought was just really risky because, as you all may know, if you've been here in the summertime, Berkeley just, right? I mean, the energy, people are out of town, all that. But it ended up actually being a huge burst of energy. People really engaged with it. We did things in people's homes. We did things at the church, and it was great. Yeah.
Well, I presume there was a vision or mission statement when you got there that predecessors had, or that. So did you just basically say, we're going to go with that for a while until I have something new to add?
It was
or was it
largely
more,
defunct.
Was it more quiet than that?
Yeah, it was just, I mean, I didn't really have to do anything because nobody really paid attention to it anyways. I mean, it was every week it was on our bulletin, but nobody could give you more than 12 words of it, right? And so, and a good portion of it really had been realized. It was strongly aspirational, and the congregation had, in many ways, met what they felt God was calling them to.
I think where I found myself confused with that 4-year model is, what do you, what do you say to the world during that 4-year process? Like, well, just wait for me in a couple of years, I'll have something to say.
Right. Well, I mean,
you're operating at some principle during the meantime.
I think for me at least, I had a strong set of operating principles about responsive, clean worship, strong, relational, grounded preaching, present pastoral care, and so some of those pieces I was very fortunate that were already in place, and some of it you just kind of have to see what you've got. I don't think you go in saying, I'm not going to change anything and wait, we're just going to wait. You're not doing that.
Right.
We were definitely, moving. It's just the question, I think part of the trap is, it's like people, Jesus is an inconvenient savior. They would prefer to have their priest stand in for that. Yep. And so there's just a tremendous amount of projection and investment that you're going to save us and you are going to do this, which is, for me, a misreading of how I want to engage a community in leadership. Do you have a question, Terry? Was your hand up? No?
No.
Okay.
I have lots of questions.
All right. So we did all this visioning. I was just working far too much in terms of hours and in terms of what I was giving. I was running myself ragged, and it came to a head one night at one of our meetings in September, and I was just totally spent. I had a wicked migraine. I was just hurting, but it was a pretty critical juncture in this visioning process, and I didn't feel I could not be there. So I showed up, gave what I could. After the meeting, one of the members of the committee, Alan's been at All Souls for many years, came up to me and said, you look awful. Go home. You look terrible. And I said, oh yeah, I need to. And so I walked to the next room where there was some more, Post-it sheets or whatever, and I start taking them down because I'm a little slow. And Sharon Roberts, an even longer term person, just looks at me and says, you look awful. Go. And it just kind of clicked, right? And she gave me a hug. That's what it was. She gave me a hug. And I realized how I had, I didn't have my bed in my office, but I had absolutely fallen into that role that had been established. And that's where, success is pretty effing intoxicating.
Yeah, right.
Right? Because, things were going just great. And yet, actually, it wasn't sustainable. So I reached out to some folks, and somebody who does a lot of work in HR said, well, don't you have a mentor in the Episcopal Church? Don't they set you up mentors to kind of work on this stuff? She said that's like she said that's one of the few things that the corporate world actually does relatively well. And I said no, that's not actually how things tend to go in our world. And
I
so,
talked before about John Dreyvaldis' research that effective leaders have strong mentors.
Just tattoo that on your brain. Not on your
forehead.
Not on your forehead. It looks a little creepy. So I reached out. So I had made a retreat with Bishop Greg Rickel about 6 months before, and found him to have a really clear idea of what was his and what was not his. And he'd done a lot of work with Friedman, and just got that stuff really well. And so I said, well, there's this one guy. He's got his own problems though. And Katie said, okay, let me get this straight. In 20 years, if a priest called you up who was in trouble because he couldn't figure this out, and he wanted the benefit of your experience, would you say, sorry, can't do that? And I said, oh, probably not. She said, yeah, so get up off your ass. And so I did. And that conversation was really phenomenally helpful. It turns out he had been at St. James in Austin, which is right next to the Seminary of the Southwest, had some assisting priests around, was growing. He burnt himself out. And so it was a conversation that I was able to say, oh, right. Yeah. This is not just what we're facing, what I'm facing. And so that started me on this path of, we can't do this and I can't do this, but what should we be doing differently? And so we did a lot of study. We did a lot of work with Israel Galindo. We did a lot of work with the Immunity to Change book, which was very helpful, both systemically and for me personally.
We'll meet that book later in the semester.
Oh, good. And then Alice Mann, who is an Alban Institute consultant, has written a lot of books on size dynamics in churches. She also happens to be an Episcopal priest. In her research, she found that the transition from pastoral to program or network size is the most challenging transition that congregations make. And Charles Fulton, who used to work in the development office for the National Church, said in his estimation about 10 to 15 Episcopal parishes actually do it successfully.
Ever a year?
10 to 15.
10 to 15%. Percent. Sorry, 10 to 15%. Sorry, 10 to 15%.
Just 10 to 15.
That's it, ever. So we're on number 14.
Pressure's on.
Yeah, right. So it's and there's really good reasons why. And I have found one of the models she uses to be really helpful in how we experienced it. And so I'd like to share it with you now.
Let me move that little.
So this is called the N curve. It's really not much of a curve, but sounds better, I think.
Sharp points on it.
Yes, it has sharp points on it. It's not very curvy.
It's a sharp, pointy curve.
So over here, she puts group-centered, and then pastor-centered. And organism and organization. What I like about Alice Mann and Israel Galindo is they are very clear to say that when it comes to size, bigger is not better, but that size matters. Because it affects the ways that your congregation is going to relate to one another, is going to relate to change, is going to relate to newcomers, is going to relate to just about anything. So it's not determinative, you're not stuck anywhere forever, but it certainly does affect a great deal of how you live. So here we start with what has been called the family size, and you guys have done this lens before. Usually under 100 or under 50 people on a Sunday, strongly led by probably a family or a couple of very tight families by matriarchs, most often, sometimes by patriarchs. And they serve as gatekeeper, organizer. When decisions are made, they're around a table, sometimes even a kitchen table. And so in this model, the leader, the priest, if the families are here, you've got a gatekeeper here, the priest is kind of over here as chaplain, right? So it is group-centered, but it's an organism. Here in the what has been called pastoral, or I've also heard shepherd sized, because one of the unfortunate effects of calling it pastoral is that when we talked about this and we're like, well, we were a pastoral church, we're moving to an export church, so we were losing our pastor?
We're not going to be pastoral anymore.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't need any more fires to fight, right? I mean, why am I creating more for myself? So as we talked about before, everything comes through there. And it often functions anywhere from 50 people on a Sunday to about 150 people on a Sunday. When Michael Barlow was the Congregational Development Officer in this diocese, one of the things he mentioned was he saw a breaking point financially in a mainstream traditional model at about 140 on a Sunday. Now, I don't know how accurate that is depending on where you are, like urban, suburban, rural, whatever. But what that says is that and this is the size of like most churches, especially in the Episcopal Church. I even think it has psychic roots in the Church of England model, that even if you've never visited England, it's like so much a part of how we think it should be, that this is the predominant model.
It breaks because you can't put any more arrows into the guy? Is that what's breaking? Okay.
Yeah. Or the guy explodes.
Implodes, explodes, either way it's not pretty. Yeah. Steve?
We were talking a little bit about that earlier, just the idea that culture shapes our sense of how institutions function.
Yeah.
And that's part of the challenge of moving away from older models and towards new models is, in a way we can't move faster than culture allows us to. And as long as culture continues to tell us that church looks like that, communities are self-selecting for people that are looking for that kind of church. So,
that is very true.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like we find folks who come to All Souls from First Pres Berkeley because we're a small, intimate church.
Yeah.
Right? Relativity is really interesting.
First Pres is like, they own half of it.
They own half of Berkeley. And they do some good things with it, but they certainly do. All right, so the next one that she points to, or the way where she places it, is the what we've called network or program. Size, and bear with me, I know the math is a little wonky, but I'm going to do this anyways. And then what does this go up to? 350 or 400?
400, I think.
And so at this point, the model is nodal, right? And so one of the images of this is like how ginger grows, or irises. Instead of a taproot that can be cut, right, you are growing, and so you can clip off a part of it, but it still continues to function.
Rhizomatic.
So this, you still have leadership. The leadership can still be central, but not at the center of the organism or the organization. So we made the shift now from organism to organization. There's a lot more structure involved, both program, then all of a sudden you've got like a finance committee, you've got maybe a few more officers, and you've got the need for lots more structure because of the activity that's taking place often. And then the corporate. And so that is 400 plus, and now there's like mega and meta and ridiculous size places. 400 plus. So what's missing, right? 150 to 250.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people with arrows in their back in the middle.
A lot of people in there. What's that?
There are a lot of people in the. If there's a gap there, there's that all those suffering people in the middle.
Yep. And so this is what Alice Mann calls the transitional size, and that's what she spent the bulk of her research examining, because she saw lots of consistency across denomination, across context, and for her, she saw this as the most challenging place for a congregation.